Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we look at 2226 San Benito Avenue, Fresno, 1921. This chapter is about the concept of home, of that one place you go back to in your mind, if you're lucky enough to have one. For Saroyan, it was the rented house on San Benito Avenue, which was officially San Benito Street, but that some people called Avenue. Today, it's an industrial area and is neighbored by the Yosemite Highway 41, which was completed in the 1930s. His time there was relatively brief, about 5 years. When he was 8, he and his siblings left the Fred Finch orphanage and, joining their mother once again, moved back to Fresno. He tells us that he grew from childhood to boyhood to the beginnings of manhood at the house on San Benito. When he was 13, his family was able to purchase a house on El Monte Way, but that house doesn't feature nearly as heavily as the house on San Benito in his writings. By volume, citations of San Benito and Carl Street show up the most in his writings. Carl Street in San Francisco is where he wrote The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze, and where he earned enough money to buy his family the house on 15th Avenue. This pinpointing of home looms large in all of Saroyan's writings. In Here Comes, There Goes You-Know-Who, he says, "But hadn't I gotten homesick for the first time in my life when I had been in New York? During Christmas week of the year 1928, I had. Well, what had I longed for during that homesickness? The rented house on San Benito Avenue that I remembered so vividly? Our own house, bought with our own savings, at 3204 El Monte Way in Fresno, in which I had grown so swiftly, from which I had gone off on my own for the first time? Was it the third-floor flat at 2378 Sutter Street in San Francisco, from which I had taken a bus to New York?" An armchair psychologist might easily attribute this questioning to his early years spent in an orphanage, unmoored from his Armenian community and extended family in Fresno. But he was one of the lucky kids who got out, who had a home and a family to go back to. And maybe this jarring movement from cultural erasure in the orphanage to total absorption by Nonna Lucy, Uncle Aram, Uncle Miron, the Manassian cousins, the whole gang, thrusted San Benito into the symbol that provided the initial suction of a sense of belonging and home. He writes, "I had a home at last, the house at 2226 San Benito. I lived there with my mother, my sisters, and my brother. All through the city were branches of my father's family and branches of my mother's family. Each branch had its own house and its own members." It's worth looking at the amount of affection he had for this place, throughout his memoirs and even into the other genres of his writings. Of course, My Name is Aram very much represents this time of Saroyan's life, though San Benito isn't explicitly called out in the book. But the character of Aram is young William, and he is around 9 years old in the book. In Obituaries, Saroyan writes, "That's the catch. And I don't mean catch 22. My address was 2226 San Benito Avenue, so 22 means special things to my years from 8 or 9 to 12 or 13. I lived in that house for 5 or 6 great years, and I sang all the time. What do I know about anything? Everything was terrible, but all I did was sing and think about my name. Was it right for me? Well, it's too late now." A side note, Joseph Heller, the writer of Catch-22, in part based the protagonist Saroyan on Saroyan. Saroyan was named for William Stonehill, the Presbyterian who sponsored his father Arminach's immigration into America, and who set Arminach up with a ministry in Paterson, New Jersey. To Saroyan, Stonehill was a concept, someone he had never met, though he did pay a visit to Stonehill's widow on that first trip to New York in 1928. But Saroyan didn't feel deeply connected to the Stonehills, or even to his father, that relationship being tragically cut short. Instead, he looked to other men in his family as father figures, and so it is that he began to love the name Aram, though his uncle Aram was both mentor and tormentor. William felt his own name should have been something like Bedros, and in his early writings used the nom de plume Sirach Gorion. As William searched for his identity after leaving the orphanage, he questioned his place in his own community with his American name and his loss of the Armenian language. In The Bicycle Rider in Beverly Hills, he writes of the orphanage, "I was called Willie. I didn't know much about the other name, although I had heard it. I do not remember having been sure it was my name. I did not know anything about nationality or religion. Who was I? I was one of the boys in the ward for small boys. Where did I belong? I didn't know, but I didn't believe I belonged where I was. Everyone in the place hated it. It wasn't home, that's all." But his culture was returned to him on San Benito, in the heart of Armenian town in Fresno. He begins this chapter, "It was my university. It was the world. It was art. It was everything." He says the years spent there were the greatest in his life, and while he admits that some of his relatives thought back on their ramshackle houses with shame, he could only look back fondly on San Benito, with its 2 barns, English walnut tree, honeysuckle, great clusters of purple-blue flowers, even though the roof leaked in many places. In Here Comes, There Goes You-Know-Who, he writes, "It was a hell of a house, and we were there for a good 3 or 4 years. Just half a block down San Benito was the edge of the playground at Emerson School, where I learned to read and write. It was a world. It was a time. It was rough. It was tough. It was murder. It was great. It was magnificent. And the people there, speaking that strange language, the people were us. We lived and we died, and it is all gone now. And if you wanted to, you could say it was never anything. I don't want to." It was at San Benito that he remembers his Grandma Lucy bathing him in a tub on the back porch, the water that needed to be first heated on the stove. And San Benito was where his mother showed him the bundle of his father's writings, an important event in his life. His son Aram, in the book Last Rites, claimed that William's emotional development was arrested due to the early death of Armenoch and the subsequent years spent at the orphanage, that these traumas made it difficult for William to form adult relationships, and the relationship between father and child. If this is true, was his happiness also trapped at San Benito, the first home he had? Saroyan's biographer, Lee Lawrence, digs into this psychology further, stating, "In Jungian psychology, the complex is that of the puer aeternus, the eternal youth, whose dazzling displays of brilliance and promise go on for too long, blocking a normal settling down into a life lived and shared with others, and, in the case of the artist, into work marked more by its content than the inventiveness of its surface style." It was on San Benito that he decided he could make of himself whatever he wanted, and that he was drawn to writing. The house becomes a symbol to him, its address numerological or even divine. He writes in Short Drive, Sweet Chariot, "A magic number, because it's the address of the house on San Benito Avenue I lived in for a number of very important years of my boyhood. It's even in my first play, My Heart's in the Highlands. I feel very good about this." And you can see in this news clipping that the whole street had a sense of whimsy to it, apparently. This description is given in the stage notes for My Heart's in the Highlands. An old white, broken-down frame house at Wright with a front porch on San Benito Avenue in Fresno, California. Steps lead down right from the porch. There is a door to the house from the porch and steps leading down at back. There's a tree center and a ramp running off left, a bench against steps, furniture in the house, a door to back room and back wall of house. There are no other houses nearby, only a desolation of bleak land and red sky. It's late afternoon of a day in August 1914. The evening sun is going down. He ends this chapter, "It was a happy house, but let us never for a minute forget the complexity of truth, for it was a house in which dwelt also rage, sorrow, hatred, and madness itself." And here we see him again facing madness in the family, the underlying theme of most of his work. When Saroyan talks about the madness in him, it often feels like it's a way of putting the pieces together of a puzzle of his life, to discover how and why he became who he is. Though he came off publicly as a confident, maybe even sometimes narcissistic person, privately he analyzed who he was and why he made so many harmful decisions in his life. By the time he began writing his memoirs, he had already shifted out of the public limelight, and that's when he began to work through his history in writing, publicly, revisiting the same events over and over to see what made them so memorable, and if they were in truth as important as he thought. Here he is speaking about the house in 1975 in a recording held by the Fresno Public Library called William Saroyan About Fresno.
Established in the house at 2226 San Benito Street, which I have preferred to call in my play My Heart's in the Highlands, 2226 San Benito Avenue instead of street. I like that word avenue was a little bit more appropriate to the method of the play. Now in that ramshackle house, which was owned by a man named Barr, who came on a bicycle once a year and checked the place and papered the walls. The wallpapers were interesting. We had a big stove in the kitchen called Excelsior, and we burned sawdust in there. You got a load of sawdust dumped into one of the two bars that were related like in an angle in the backyard for $3. That sawdust would get us through the winter, and it was made a beautiful hot fire. And we also had a cat that came with the house when we were there, and I loved that cat, and I saw it catch mice and eat them, and I was fascinated by that. I saw a gopher in the backyard catch a chick, one of the little chicks of our hens, and drag it down under the soil, cheaping for its poor little life. And I'm not even sure about how that happened, whether it was a gopher or some other subterranean creature or a snake or what, but I remember the little cheeping of that little soft chick, Easter time chick, you might say. That house at 2226 San Benito Avenue was the arena, if I may use that word again, in which selling papers and selling the Saturday Evening Post, my growth was, and reading books from the public library and seeing a lot of movies, and the vaudeville at the Hippodrome Theater. I couldn't see the vaudeville at the White Theater, which was orphan vaudeville, because I couldn't get into that one free. And the lowest ticket was 25 cents, which in those days was a lot of money. But the round table in the dining room of that house at on San Benito Street, San Benito Avenue, as I insisted on calling it, was where I did a lot of thinking and a lot of drawing and a lot of planning and a lot of writing in tablets, trying to decide what my life was to be.
San Benito is a dream worth holding on to, and the chapter subtextually asks the reader what their San Benito is, be it a place or a time, a feeling of home. What's yours? Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.